Hello, my friends. I am back with another, hopefully interesting video for you. So I got a request to do a video about how I do my Instagram readings, which are these kind of super short, really pithy readings. And I was trying to think of how do I do that? And really what I do is I just try to sort of work fast and get out of the way. That's kind of my main thing. I think, how can this be really fast and practical? What's each card doing? What does it mean? And then I try to do it without a whole lot of overthinking. But how do I make a whole video about that? It's not easy. So what I thought I would do is actually take you through a handful of those readings and kind of deconstruct them. Tell you how I got there and why I interpreted the cards the way I did. And then also talk about whether or not I think I was successful. And a lot of the times I'm pretty successful given the generality and kind of non-specificity of the readings. And in other times I kind of am lazy and I don't really get there. And I think it's helpful sometimes for you to see readers talk about that. I say a lot as I go through these examples that this is something you probably shouldn't do too much with real readings. And I think it's actually a valuable practice technique to do a reading and take it apart and justify how you got there and decide whether or not it was any good. The reason I say you shouldn't do it too much with real readings is you can really start to doubt your ability and doubt all the things that make reading kind of special and magical. You do, in a sense, have to kind of surrender to your intuition sometimes. And so an interpretation may show up that seems not really justifiable later, or a thought will pop up, or something will happen in the context of a reading, and it will make total sense in that moment and may never make sense again, and that's okay. So what this is not meant to do is kind of set you up for a trap for like self-flagellation or beating yourself up for not being able to go back a month later and figure out how you got where you did. What it is, though, is meant to be a way of looking at a reader who, if you're watching my channel, hopefully you like what I do, and kind of seeing how I got there, and then me kind of reflecting and saying, did I do my job well? Or was I lazy, And I'm happy to say that in most of the examples, I think they're pretty good. And then in a couple of them, I think they're not. And that's inevitable because we are human and we're not perfect. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go over to PowerPoint. I'm going to talk through the readings, just casually as we do around here, share my thoughts and how I got where I did, why I interpreted the cards the way I did. And then that's really all I'm going to do. So there you go. All right. So let's head over to PowerPoint and we'll take a look. All right. Here we go. I randomly pulled readings from my feed. Most of them are pretty recent, but I did try to go back in time a little bit too so that I could choose things that I, likely had forgotten how I got there. So this was today, actually. So this is a spread. All of these are, I think, I'm pretty sure all of these are based on the today's mission prompt. I don't think of it as a question even because, of course, it's not really one. And I guess the other qualifiers I'll put in place is that these are really just meant to be quick exercises to keep the skills sharp. And that's really what it's about. These aren't predictive. They're not about me solving world peace or really even doing any sort of groundbreaking interpretation, but just to sort of put the cards down and say, okay, what's today's mission? What's today's goal? And come up with a clear, concise answer that makes sense and that is invested, not invested, that's not the word I'm looking for, that it's based really on the cards and it's effective in its way. So this was today's. So we have the Six of Swords, the Empress, and the Six of Wands. And so the mission that I came up with, today's goal, today's aim, was think happy thoughts about ways to own yourself and your great gifts. So it's easier for me to be a little more forgiving of this reading because it literally was just today. But I'll tell you how I got there and what I think of the reading. So think happy thoughts, that's the Six of Swords. And what that really is about is that 6 numerologically is beauty, beautiful, balanced. And so when you put that with swords, the mind, thinking, mentality, etc., it's really just beautiful thoughts. And so that became Think Happy Thoughts. Own Yourself is the Empress. And the Empress is an interesting thing. I've actually tried over the years to kind of get away from the stereotype of nurturing with both the queens and with the Empress. I think that it's definitely a part of it. But I've tried to think, how can I empower these, these sort of feminine archetypes a little bit more than just nurturing, motherhood, And so for me, the Empress over time has come, in some cases, to really being about owning your power, owning your shit, owning your badassery, as an Empress would. And so that's really where that came from. It's really it, just that the Empress she owns herself. She is, when you think about what an Empress is sort of historically, a woman in power was rare. And in order for her to be in power and maintain it, she would obviously need to own her power. And so the Empress has a lot to do with owning your power to me. And then the Six of Wands is the final card. And that, very much like the Six of Swords, has to do with beauty. And what I allowed that to mean here was sort of great, great, lovely, whatever. And so your gifts, your talents, I think about fire a lot as talent or vocation. And so that's how that came to be. And so think happy thoughts about ways to own yourself and your great gifts. And I think this reading is not bad. I think it's pretty good, actually. Fuck it. I'm going to say it's a good reading. Because I can find evidence for it in all the cards based on the way I interpret them. And it's something doable. It's something you can sort of have a mantra over the day about how do you make your gifts, how do you celebrate your gifts in the mind rather than denigrating them, which is something that I tend to do. I have a bad habit of sort of making myself smaller or minimizing myself to fit expectations or to avoid appearing arrogant. And this felt really kind of right on to me. So I would say, if I were going to be really super critical, I would say the Six of Wands, as great gifts. It's not, it's not like the most, it's not the easiest connection there. It's not the easiest to draw a line between that and where I was going. But so much of reading, I think, too, has to do with allowing for that kind of elasticity. And so I think it's good. I'm happy with that. I can justify beautiful fire, Six and Wands as great gifts, with gifts meaning talent and great meaning lovely or talent or beautiful. A talent is a beautiful thing and it's a gift. And so that's where that came from. So I feel pretty good about this one. This is another recent one, and this was Justice, the Nine of Cups, and the Knight of Swords. And so the mission was, justice can be a cause for joy for a minute before you start chasing reality again. And this was Thursday, so this was yesterday. I'm recording this on Friday, the 20th of December. And this honestly was totally informed by the impeachment vote in the United States and was totally influenced by politics. And so what I did here was I actually looked a little bit more literally at the images than I normally do. So I do tend to rely a lot on the numerology or the kind of key phrases that I've come up with over the years for the cards. But in this case, I really went with kind of a fairly literal interpretation, especially for the Nine and the Knight. So justice, I let be justice. You can see here justice can be a cause for joy. So justice in this case literally is just justice. It is what it is. The Nine of Cups, numerologically, I would normally interpret as sort of emotional labor. Nines having to do with like the push to get up the hill, like the need to kind of gather your strength to complete a task, and of course cups being emotions and feelings and sensations, etc. But there's the Rider-Waite-Smith wish card kind of interpretation, and that felt appropriate here as I was looking at this combination. So that becomes a cause for joy. So this sort of wish card, Nine of Cups, joyful, abundant feeling that is traditional in the Rider-Waite-Smith system. And then chasing reality, I mean, the Knight of Swords here is literally chasing his motorcycle, which is running off on him. And I let reality be air. And the reason that I let reality be swords, or air in this case, is that they are really the realist. They're the least likely to be tainted by imagination. Well, imagination isn't the right word. They're the least likely to be tainted by dishonesty or by sensation. You know, the mind is pretty sharp there, and it sees things as it is. And knights are chasers anyway, they're hunters. And so that is where that came from. And again, I don't feel bad about this at all. I think I can justify it in the cards. But that's how I got there. And it was really just sort of like an interesting combination. And this was definitely one where I was struggling a bit, because I think that Justice is a card that is often hard for me to read out of context, you know. And one of the things about this prompt that I do on Instagram, this "What's Today's Mission" prompt, is that it sort of disobeys my golden rule, which is that a reading be specific and that a question be really clear. And again, these are exercises that I do just to kind of keep the skills sharp and sometimes to test out new decks. But what's today's mission, you know, is not super specific. It would be a better question if it were what's today's mission at work? What's today's mission even in the meeting with my boss? Or what's today's mission in my relationship with so-and-so? That sort of gives you more context. But again, this is really just an exercise, you know. And the reason that I do these and put these on Instagram is because I feel like it's like a little bit of accountability, you know. By putting them up there, I sort of have to come up with something rather than just laying out the card and saying, fine, I'll just, you know, whatever, sweep them back into the deck. How this became connected to politics at large was really justice and my own worldview. And I laid out the cards, and they just were not making sense to me. They were just kind of, what, you know. And so I said, well, what's justice right now? You know, what is that? I couldn't place it. But then I thought, well, let me look at the world largely. And then I thought, wait, I don't feel good about what's happening in the world right now, even if I believe, you know, in certain things. And then it kind of clicked. It was like this burst of joy in the Nine of Cups is very temporary when you look at the situation of the Knight of Swords. You know, his ride is riding away without him. He's got to come back down to earth and kind of chase the crap that happens in life. But you do get a minute of saying, okay, justice was served, and that's really a good thing, before I go back to chasing the banality of life. All right, so the next one this was from a couple days ago. I think this was late last week, or maybe this weekend. So this was the Knight of Cups, the Five of Swords, and the Moon. And the Moon is a really interesting card for me. So today's mission: a true romantic shakes up their fantasies. This to me makes sense and also omits a fair amount. But it is connected, and I'll tell you how I got there. So obviously the true romantic is the Knight of Cups. And the Knight of Cups showed up a couple times for me during the time period where I did this reading. And the Knight of Cups is in kind of a very quick way the knight in shining armor. You know, they're the romantic. They're not necessarily a stable romantic, but they are very, very romantic. And the combination of the swords and the moon is where fantasies came from. The moon to me often has to do with fantasy or imagination or fantastical qualities, and of course that fantasy lives in the mind. You know, it is a creation of our intellect. And so that combination of swords and the moon is where fantasies came from. And then the 5 is about instability or conflict or breaking things up. And so it became shaking things up, as it often does for me in certain situations. This is also interesting. I made a video about this once before, and it's about how certain cards speak louder than others. And so I think the Knight of Cups and the Moon really are the two loudest cards. The Five of Swords in this case is a little bit more of a carrier, even though it's the verb. The true romantic is the subject and the fantasies are the object. The verb is shaking things up. But what you'll notice I didn't do is dwell too much on the Five of Swords meaning of sort of intellectual or communicational conflict, fighting. There's a lot of kind of associations of the Five of Swords with fights, and that's not what I did here. I didn't say, for example, that the true romantic fights their fantasy, because that didn't make a whole lot of sense. A true romantic does have an active fantasy life. And so contextually, to say a true romantic fights their fantasy life felt wrong. It really became about shaking things up. And what I will often say about the five is that it takes the stasis or the stability of the four and it shakes it up, it cracks it. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. In this case, contextually, it felt like a good thing because, for romance to sustain itself, it has to be kept fresh. And so that was kind of the contextual journey, essentially, of how I got there. That a real romance needs to keep things spicy. And so that's how I landed there. And so, again, I think that's a decent reading. I promise there are some in here I'm not super proud of, and this is one of them. So this is the Eight of Pentacles, Three of Pentacles, and Nine of Swords. And this was another one where I was just sort of like, I did this quickly and I wasn't really thinking too hard, which can sometimes be beneficial, but here I don't think it was. So what the mission was, as you can see here, was getting anything productive done might pre-exhaust you, but it ain't going to do itself. And so how I got there was a bit of a circuitous road. And I think the thing that most people would say is like, how did you get pre-exhaustion? And that is a little bit of a stretch. And I think even if you look at the array, so the pre-exhaustion came from the Nine of Swords, which is the last card in the spread. It's the last card in the array. Nines are exhausting because you have to push to get things done. And so they're mentally, the combination of swords and nine can be sort of mental exhaustion. It can be, anxiety. It can be stressful. It can be kind of the Rider-Waite-Smith thing of fear, that you won't get it done, or just fear generally. But for me, oftentimes it's just about thinking a lot and just being mentally exhausted by it. Getting anything productive done is the combination of really the Eight of Pentacles and the Three. But this is where it kind of falls apart a little bit, because I don't actually give any thought really in this interpretation to the Three. In this reading, the Five I said was kind of a carrier. This was really just, I kind of ignored it. I think where it played its part was the idea of like, it ain't gonna do itself. But I could have gotten that message without the Three, because the Eight of Pentacles is active. Looking back, and I'm trying to remember, I think that it ain't gonna do it by itself came from the fact that the Three of Pentacles often has to do with collaboration. And so I took that to mean like you have to collaborate with the work you have to do, or because it's not going to do itself. And I think the other condition at play when I did this reading was that I was just feeling exhausted by the day ahead already before I had even started it. And so like I imposed my own, state of being on the reading. And so it's fine. I think if I were doing this now, I probably would not have come up with that. I think if I were looking at it now and I were doing this kind of quickly, I would say you can work as hard as you want with as many people as you want, and it's not going to stop your mind from telling you that it's a failure, for example, or something, So this is one where I don't think I did the best job grounding the reading in the real cards. But it's fine. I think I do subscribe to the quote from Yoav Ben-Dov that there aren't really accidents in readings. And I think if you come up with an interpretation in a reading and it lands, that's valid. What I'm really doing is kind of showing you my process and then looking back on my process and seeing how well I executed my own techniques. And in this case, I would say that I don't think I did a great job grounding it. And, I if you watch my videos, you'll hear me say that you need to be able to kind of find evidence for your interpretation in the spread. And I think in this case, I didn't really do a very good job working backwards. It's harder to justify what I came up with than the previous couple. So here's another one. This is think hard about what you've been thinking you want. Is it what really matters? And so this is the the Seven of Swords. No. The Nine of Swords. I'm right. The Knight of Swords and the Seven of Cups. And this is my little Halloween deck. And so how did I get here? So sevens, when I think about the numerology of tarot, are very frequently about an internalization and like an assessment, assessing what's important, assessing where we are, assessing ourselves, etc. So it's sort of a moment of reflection on the internalized information that we have. How do I feel? What's really important, etc. And so think hard about thinking about what you want. That has to do with all the swords. So think hard. That actually is about the idea of assessing, again, what is really important to you. What you've been thinking you want is a combination of the Knight of Swords, who, Knight's desire. That is kind of one of their action verbs. They hunt, they desire, they search for. And so the Knight of Swords does spend a lot of time thinking about that. So he's thinking about what he wants. But the cups also speak to desire too. And so, that's sort of where what you've been thinking you want. Is it what really matters? The is it what really matters comes from the Seven of the Swords and the Cups. We have two sevens. And so it's a reassessment of one's state. And so to parse this one or take it apart a little bit, when I first reviewed it, I thought, I really did kind of a nebulous job here. But there are two sevens and there are swords and cups. And so think hard about what you've been thinking you want. Is it really what matters? That whole sense of like thinking about what matters, thinking about what you think you want, all of that comes from the sevens and the swords. What you want comes from the Knight and the Cups. You don't really get a whole lot of justification beyond that. Like I ask, is it what really matters? Like is it what really matters comes from the seven. The two sevens, but have I really landed there well? It's, again, this is one where like right now I sort of like the interpretation I came up with more than I like my ability to go back and kind of justify what I came up with. I think it's fine. And I guess this is a good time to point out that like you really probably shouldn't do this with a real reading. Like this is good for exercises you do, but like to go back and rework a reading that you did for someone is in this way is probably really going to like crush your spirit. I think you do have to trust your instincts as you're doing a reading. And if you can validate it in some way, you're okay, I think. And here I can do it. I just sort of feel like, did I do the best job of grounding it? I don't know. But what I will give myself points for is that I came up with a sentence that is actually kind of a valuable thing to say in a general reading like this. Like, what do you really think you want? Is that really what matters to you? Is that really what you desire? So, I would say this is kind of a B minus, objectively. But as an answer, I would give it more of a B plus because I think that it actually does have relevance. So This is an interesting thing to do. It's an interesting activity, kind of work backwards from old readings and see how you got where you did, and to justify your thought process. And I'm only doing this not because I think this is something you should really spend a lot of time doing, but because I just want to kind of show you how I get where I get, and and do I always think I'm good at it, and that's not always the case. Here's another. So this is the Judgment, 10 of Swords, and 3 of Swords. So the mission here was wake up, overthinking is done, deal with it, it made you better, smarter, and sharper, deal. This is a place where I think my interpretation is kind of good, although the way I phrased it, I wish I could have rewritten. So it's probably pretty clear that wake up comes from Judgment, and that overthinking comes from the 10 of Swords. Better, smarter, and sharper comes from the 3 of Swords, not the Rider-Waite-Smith sort of standard interpretation, but rather the idea that 3 means growth and expansion, and the swords have to do with the mind. And so what I kind of did was I took 3 concepts, better, smarter, and sharper, from the swords. Better is less justifiable there. I got there because being smarter and sharper is usually kind of better. There's an interesting thing with the 3 of Swords, because learning something new means that you're changed and you can't go back to who you were before. So the thing that I would say here is if I were to write this again, I would probably kind of rethink better, certainly as a phrase or term. And, the deal with it, sort of deal, that stuff, that's just kind of my own social media kind of branding of being like, deal with it, like there is kind of a flippancy to swords. It's also interesting as I'm going through these now, and I hadn't thought about this before, how many swords cards show up. And I didn't, these are just randomly chosen, but so I think that this is a pretty good interpretation, although I really wish I had kind of phrased it better. Overthinking is done. I would probably say there now, like, you have to stop overthinking this. You've learned everything you can. Look at how it's made you better, smarter, and sharper, or look at how it's changed you and made you smarter and sharper, So in this case, I would say it's, my writing isn't as good as I would like it to be, but these are often done really quickly. So this was one I did during a snowstorm. This is one I kind of like a lot. And this is Strength, the Queen of Pentacles, and the Moon. And so here we have muster the energy to take care of your fantasy life. And so mustering the energy has everything to do with strength. So for me, strength isn't just the act of being strong. Sometimes you have to gather strength. Take care is all about the Queen of Pentacles, again, sort of reverting to the queens as nurturers. What I wish I had said in this spread is that there's a real practical daily value to doing this, because the Queen of Pentacles really grounds the reading. And then, of course, your fantasy life is the Moon. So that one I feel pretty good about. I don't really have a whole lot of critique. I wish I had been maybe a little more specific. This is one that I did a while ago, and it's a very, very similar reading. And it's cool to see, I think, sometimes how the same message can pop up. I think this was relatively connected to this one. They weren't that far apart. And so this one says, own your fantasy life, Miss Thang. It's how you figure out what's actually important today. Similar reading. So how did we get there? Well, owning your fantasy life. So owning is all about the Empress, and that's a theme that you saw earlier in an interpretation of the Empress. And actually, Miss Thang comes from the Empress too. It's just another kind of like own your power, lady kind of moment. What's really important today comes from the Pentacles cards, the card, the Seven of Pentacles. So again, remember that sevens, of course, are really grounded. I'm sorry, no, sevens are really about self-assessment and what's, reevaluation and internalizing. And the today actually comes from just the daily nature of Pentacles. So what's really important today? The kind of weak link, I guess, or the link at all, is the Knight of Swords. And the Knight of Swords here is serving the role of figuring out. He's sort of sussing things out. He's figuring out. So that's the link there. I think it's fine. Usually knights are more active in a reading. In this case, it just didn't feel like the Knight of Swords was all that active. And I guess in terms of the sword, or in terms of the knights, probably the Knight of Swords is not super active. Again, when you have more context than just drawing 3 random cards and saying, what's today's mission? It's easier to ground him or ground them all. But that's where I landed. So I do think that the knight in this card is kind of a carrier, and maybe I did neglect it a little bit, but it's fine. So this is today's mission. You have a responsibility to yourself to figure out one way to put big talk into action. And so we have another 7 of Pentacles. And so in that case, the idea of Pentacles as daily life or responsibilities came to the fore for me. Responsibility is another thing that Pentacles or coins frequently mean for me. And the responsibility to yourself, the self, again, is that self-examination or that self-exploration of the 7. Big talk is the 10 of Swords. And so it became literally just about 10 being the largest number and talk being the mind, talk being in the intellect, big talk. The swords are communication. Action is the Knight of Swords. And so the Knight of Swords, I just said, isn't the most active of knights, but probably is the most active of swords court, And so he takes thought or words and puts them into action. And so this one I think is a really successful reading, because I feel like all the cards kind of are given like their full weight. I don't kind of gloss over anything. It's sort of, I think, a really good reading and also really good advice. This one here, as life expands, you have a duty to your emotional health, not in an abstract, modern, generalized self-care way, but in a grounded, practical, tangible way. And so, as life expands is the 3 of coins, or the 3 of discs here. And 3, again, expansive. So growing, getting larger. And as life expands, the pentacles or the discs are life itself. So life is getting bigger. You have a duty to your emotional health. Here's where it's sort of, you get kind of an elision, I think you would say in grammar. So the duty also comes to, comes from the pentacles, both the 3 and the ace. Your emotional health comes from the 4 of cups. And this is where I get a little sort of like, you know what I mean? Because there's not a whole lot in the 4 of cups that speaks to emotional health. How I got there is that 4s are very stable and they're very, foundational. And so that little journey from the 4 of cups being sort of emotional stability to emotional health, was a little bit of a leap, but it took me saying, okay, emotional stability can be a very healthy thing. And so that's where that came from. And so while it might be a little bit of a stretch, that's kind of what we do in readings. Sometimes we have to push and pull, but I can justify it. Emotional stability can be very healthy. As life expands, you have a duty to your emotional health, not in an abstract, modernized, general self-care way, but in a grounded, practical, tangible way. That's where the ace of discs comes in, the sort of grounded, practical, and tangible. The ace, in this case, meaning to me the essence of the suit of earth. And so I didn't really think about the number other than that it's the first one. And so I allowed the number 1 to sort of just encapsulate the essence of the suit of pentacles or earth. And so that's kind of where grounded, practical, and tangible comes into place. The number itself didn't really here. This one, so here's one where I sort of played on a tongue twister. And this is a reading where actually an extra card in this deck, this is the Saki Saki Tarot, which has a card called the Artist, came into play. And so to sit in solemn silence on a dull dark dock sets the stage for artistic penury. And then I rephrased, in other words, do something arty or you're going to feel left out. So sitting in solemn silence is the 4 of Swords. And that's that sort of inert, inertness of 4, and the silence of the Rider-Waite-Smith interpretation. Setting the stage is the artist, and then artistic penury is the 5 of coins. And the coins here matter less than the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith interpretation of the 5 of coins having to do with poverty, and feeling left out, feeling excluded from something. And so that's where that came from. The dull, dark dock really was just me playing with language. And I have a vague sense of when I saw the artist card of having that feeling of like sitting on a dock. And so my sort of rephrasing of my little clever moment was do something arty or you're going to feel left out, was really just putting the initial sentence into a slightly less, pretentious language. But I think that this is a pretty good one. I wouldn't critique this too much. This was the High Priestess, the 8 of Wands, and the 8 of Swords. Keep what you're working on a secret to sustain your passion and energy. And so here, working on, so I'll take this part. So keep what you're working on is really the 8 in both the Wands and the Swords, because 8, of course, is work. It's the effort of making. And the secret is the High Priestess, who is not the most forthcoming. And then sustaining passion and energy really comes from the combination of the 8 of Wands and the 8 of Swords. And it's not, here they kind of work as one card for me. It's not, passion is fire and energy is swords. I think that they both have energy and they both have passion. And so they really worked together for me as one card. And I didn't really feel the need to sort of say, your passionate creative energy and your intellectual, communicative energy. That just, like, what I got out of this felt like enough. And so even though the 8 of Wands and the 8 of Swords kind of work together, I don't feel like I gave any one of them short shrift, because they felt like, given the look of the cards, given the number, given the energy of them, they really seem to just reinforce each other rather than sort of meaning anything individual. Here's another one that I just sort of think is not a great end result. So this is the Mother of Coins, or the Queen of Coins. Oh God, I can't even see that. I think that's the Hermit, and the Devil. And so this one says, take the best care of banality. And taking care of banality is what the Queen of Coins does. She takes care of life. She takes care of banality. By making it a spiritual path, that's the Hermit, and a wild ride, that's the Devil. I think that this is a total cop-out on my part. And I think I just really didn't have the energy to go farther. And so I think that this actually is a really bad reading. Even in the context of a very general today's mission kind of thing. Why I think it's a bad reading is I do think I interpreted the cards, so take the best care of banality. That's what the Queen of Coins does. Make it a spiritual path. The Hermit has a spiritual path, and the wild ride is the Devil, and the Devil is a wild ride. But what I think I came up with is really nonsense. What does that mean? Take the best care of banality by making a spiritual and a wild ride. Looking back, I know what I meant, which was like, you have to sort of take the daily stuff and elevate it and make it exciting, but that's a much better way to say what I meant to say than this. This is the kind of garbage that drives me nuts. Like, when if I had gotten this reading from myself or for someone else, I would be like, that's bullshit. Like, that doesn't make any sense. How do I do it? How do I make a spiritual path and a wild ride out of banality? Like, what does that even mean? And of course, what I meant was you have to take like the daily chores and invest them with spirituality and fun, which is very like a teaspoon of sugar. But that would have been a much better interpretation than what I came up with. So I interpreted the cards fine, but the way that I gave them language is shitty. So that's a bad one. This is the last one. So here we have Temperance, the Page of Wands, and the High Priestess. And this one I kind of like, although I don't think it's the most practical answer. So today's mission: moderate undue enthusiasm for shit you really don't understand much. I know that there was something happening in the world when I did this reading that made this feel very witty. And so I liked it then, and I like it now, although I can't remember what the thing was that made me think this. But moderation is the Temperance card. Undue enthusiasm is the Page of Wands. Now, the Page of Wands really isn't undue, but here's a place where like context really worked. So shit you don't really understand is the High Priestess. So moderate enthusiasm for the High Priestess. Moderate enthusiasm for shit you don't understand much. The undue really comes from the fact that this is a situation you don't really understand, and so your enthusiasm for it is not really warranted. You don't actually know what it is you're getting excited about. I don't think this is the most practical reading, but I do find it really satisfying. And I did that day. I really wish I could remember what it was that got me here. But I do find this kind of a satisfying answer, even out of context. And I think, again, it's just so much about what happens in that moment. And so that's another reason why, I think it's helpful to kind of do practice readings and then sort of go in reverse and see how you got there. But I really wouldn't do it for a real reading unless you were trying to figure out what went wrong. And I wouldn't do it all that much. I think it's helpful to kind of go back and deconstruct what you did as a practice activity. But I really think you can inflict a lot of damage on your ego if you're doing that for everything. Because sometimes you really do have to trust what's going on. Like, here's one that I really feel like I probably, if I had given this to someone as a professional reading, I probably would have refunded their money. There are other ones like this one where it's a little harder for me to justify what I came up with, but I can do it, and ultimately I trusted my instinct, and I came up with something that is valid, and that you can do. It's life is getting more busy, life is expanding, your emotional health matters, and you have to practice self-care in a real grounded way, not in some kind of ephemeral, unidentifiable way. So while this one may be a little bit harder to justify, it's a better reading than this one, which I can justify really easily, but that doesn't really say anything. And so the reason that I'm sharing this with you is just that. I think for practice readings, this is a good exercise. I really do. But I would discourage you from doing it too much with real readings. Again, unless you were trying to figure something out. And in that case, I might do it with a coach or something. But I wanted you to kind of see a window into how I do these readings and what kind of path I take to get there. I do, as I said in the intro, I think, do these really quickly. And it is just an exercise. It's a way of kind of saying, how can I play with the cards today? I don't have any readings to do, or I just want to take them out, and what's a little lesson I could teach myself? And I don't stress too much about it. I just let them talk to me. Most of the time, they do a pretty good job. Sometimes I have a harder time listening. Sometimes I have a harder time putting what I mean into language. All of that is fair. We're not great every day. And so while I think this is a shitty reading, this one here, I'm forgiving myself for it. You know why? Because I probably did it in about 3 minutes. Because I was like, I have a couple minutes. I want to look at this deck. I haven't looked at it in a while, and let's draw some cards and see what's what. And sometimes I'm more connected than others. So there we have it. So hopefully that was interesting. The thing I, again, want to reiterate is that this should not be used as a tool to make yourself feel bad about your skill. This should be a tool to explore really how I do what I do, so you kind of understand how I read in one way. And also just a thing that can be helpful as a practice activity. So for practice readings, for Instagram readings, as something to do, quick, not overthought, not super like woo-woo, just like really down to earth, and then go back in a couple weeks and say, how'd I do? And why did I do that? And what would I do differently next time? And to forgive ourselves when we're not on our game, as sometimes happens. So I hope this was interesting as always. I hope you enjoyed it. It's always fun for me to talk through this stuff. And it's useful for me too as a reader to go back and say, how did I do that day? Because, we all have days. So if I don't make another video before the new year, I'm not sure whether or not I will. Happy New Year either way. Looking forward to 2020, and I hope that everything is good. Be good.